Let me, okay. Let me share my screen. Okay, so if I do this, that's not the end already. Great. All right. Thank you, Onab, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give a presentation in this series. When I first dreamed of the idea of sort of having you guys organize a series like this, I didn't think I would be invited, so thanks for putting me on the spot. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to talk about what I have done during my career, and specifically how my status as an interdisciplinary researcher has allowed me to really target my knowledge and expertise to some of the real global challenges that we're facing as a society. And so I'll begin by giving you sort of a brief overview of what it is that I do and what my career trajectory has been like. And then I'll talk a little bit about how my work has been applied to different cases where it tries to address specific types of challenges. Okay, so to begin, I am essentially trained as a social neuroscientist, or to put it differently, I tend to take a social neuroscience research in what I do. So what that basically means is that at my core, I'm an experimental psychologist. So my everyday is spent conducting experiments. So I love sort of research design and collecting data and analyzing data. But not only do I focus on experimental psychology, I go beyond the bounds of psychology as a discipline, and I often integrate both theory and techniques from a lot of other disciplines to help address my central research questions. And so in addition to experimental psychology, I often dabble a little bit in philosophy. For instance, we're just about to submit a philosophy paper with a collaborator of mine, looking at how human social cognition is special, and it's something I'm very excited about. I also do a lot of legal decision-making research, and a lot of the examples of the application of my research to the real world and to global challenges are going to really hinge on that domain. So we do experiments looking at how people make decisions about things like responsibility and punishment during criminal offenses, but also looking more broadly at things like human rights law, for instance. I'm also trained as a social psychologist, and so I'm very steeped in social psychology theory. And I really appreciate the beauty of social psychology in that it takes the context into account, takes the social context into account. So a lot of the theorizing in my research comes from social psychology. I tend not to use social psychology methods, but it really sort of hinges on that. I'm a developmental psychologist as well these days, so some of my research questions lend themselves to studying infants and young children, and so mainly through collaboration, I've done quite a bit of work in developmental psychology. I also do some work in what we call comparative psychology or evolutionary anthropology, where we look at how non-human animals behave, and we compare that to human behavior as well. And again, I do a lot of this mainly through collaboration. And then finally, I do economic research as well. And so I have economists as collaborators, and we use economic games in some of our paradigms. And we tend not to focus as much on economic theory, but the sort of behavioral economics method. And hinging or sort of uniting all of these themes is the idea that I am still a neuroscientist. So most of my work uses some type of neuroscience methodology. But I tend to think of myself as a neuroscientist who's not interested in the brain, specifically the social questions, the sort of big challenges that we'll talk about today, are really what sort of gets me going and gets me excited. And for me, the brain is really important because it serves as another tool in my toolkit. So it's another approach I can use to gain some deeper insight into these social questions. So I always tell people I'm not that interested in what a neuron is doing, but I'm interested in how the activity of those neurons are going to influence different types of social processes. So the neuroscience is very critical, But again, the focus, the motivator isn't the neuroscience per se or the brain per se. It's really these social questions underlying it. So in my research, I study social cognition, broadly construed, which basically means I try to figure out how people think about other people. And I think it's perhaps the most interesting and fundamental thing any one person can study, because it underpins so many phenomena that we might care about in our everyday lives. And so as a result of that, taking this interdisciplinary approach to studying social cognition really gives me a lot of benefits, I think, and it gives the research a lot of benefits. In and of itself, social cognition is an interdisciplinary pursuit. And so all of the disciplines I listed on the previous slide, they all study social cognition from a slightly different perspective, which is one of the reasons interdisciplinarity is important to me, because I don't like sort of sitting in my disciplinary silo and thinking about a topic. I'm always wondering what other disciplines have to say about exactly the same thing, because they're coming at it from a different perspective. And so being interdisciplinary really gives me a lot of benefits. Again, the main benefit is the novel insight. If you think about the big challenges facing us as a population, take something like the pandemic we're all going through. There's sort of a public health crisis that's happening, and so epidemiology and public health is going to be relevant. There's the whole sort of medical side. How do you treat patients, both in terms of medical management? So how do you prioritize which patients get treated? How do you structure hospitals so you can treat as many patients as possible? But also the sort of nuts and bolts of the medical practice. So things like engineering, right? What kinds of machines and ventilators and treatments do we need? Or biochemistry, what kind of vaccine can we develop to combat this virus? Then there's also the economic concerns because of things like lockdown. You have pressures on the economy if people are sick. There's economic pressures there as well. And then there are tons of social concerns surrounding how do we get people to comply with the best advice at mitigating the pandemic? How do we allow people to continue having social interactions under this kind of a situation? So any real global challenge that we're facing is by definition an interdisciplinary challenge, right? It's something that sits between lots of different disciplines, and just focusing on a vaccination, for instance, or focusing on the social concerns isn't going to be sufficient if we're truly going to combat this pandemic. And so being interdisciplinary then allows you to have novel insights because these real world problems sit at the boundaries of different disciplines. The other benefit of being interdisciplinary, and this is something I'm going to talk to a lot when I start giving you more specific examples of what I've done throughout my career, is really the communication advantage it holds. As scientists, we tend to be steeped in our disciplines and we think about the world from that particular disciplinary perspective. But being interdisciplinary forces you to get out of your comfort zone, right? It forces you to have conversations with people who are very intelligent but have no idea what your jargon means, have no idea about the theoretical background that you're using to motivate your research. So to be able to communicate to those people and actually do interdisciplinary research really forces you to become a better communicator. And as a result, you're now able to communicate to a much wider audience. And so I think when I first started doing research, I couldn't really explain to like my mother what it is that I did specifically, because I didn't know how to communicate outside of my narrow disciplines. But now, because of a career spent doing this kind of work, I feel like I can talk to anyone about my research and have them understand it, whether I'm having a very technical conversation or a philosophical conversation. I'm just talking to somebody off of the street who's interested in the kinds of things that I'm interested in. So I think that's the second real benefit. The third benefit, and again, I might be a little biased here, but I think this approach is much more interesting. I feel like academic disciplines have been around for hundreds of years in some cases, and we've sort of picked all of the low-hanging fruit. And so the very interesting questions are the questions on the borders of these disciplines, right? Are the interdisciplinary questions. So I feel like what I do every day is very interesting because every day I'm doing something a little different. And that works well for someone like me. But also the kinds of questions I can address, I think, are much more interesting than the standard questions only a social psychologist would be able to address, or only a cognitive neuroscientist would be able to address. And so by having this interdisciplinary approach, I feel like my work is more rewarding for me as well. So how did I end up here? How did I get to be this crazy interdisciplinary researcher? Well, my trajectory actually started while I was still in primary and secondary school. So I grew up on the beautiful Caribbean island of Trinidad. And there I was always a classic nerd. So I was always really good at school. In particular, I was always really good at things like math and English, right? So I tended to be good at the things where you were either really good at STEM stuff or you were really good at humanities stuff. I was always really good at both, and that always presented me a challenge because as I went forward in my schooling, I hated the idea that I had to specialize, right? That I had to give up some of the things that I found quite interesting and sort of pick subjects for A levels, for instance, which meant that other subjects I couldn't do. And so I ended up focusing at the A levels, as an example, on economics, English literature, and history, which was sort of a weird combination, right? It wasn't quite business, it wasn't quite humanities. But I think I've always been this interdisciplinary type of person. Nonetheless, by the time I was ready to leave and go to university for my bachelor's degree, I was convinced that I was going to be a filmmaker. And so I actually entered Howard University, which is where I did my bachelor's in the US in Washington, DC. I entered into their communication school and I was all prepared to do film. And for the first year and a half that I was there, that's what I did. I took theater classes. I made short student films. I actually worked with a bunch of directors who are now very famous in Hollywood. So I always asked myself, what if I had continued doing that? But in any case, while doing a lot of my work in film and journalism, I realized that it wasn't intellectually stimulating enough. And so there was a lot of rigor that went into it. It was a very meticulous practice, but I found that it didn't really challenge me. And the whole reason I wanted to get into filmmaking anyway is that I wanted to be able to influence lots of people. I wanted to be able to tell stories that would have an impact that might change people's thinking around a particular issue. But I soon realized that perhaps filmmaking wasn't the path forward for me. And so I ended up in a crisis because I was in the middle of my bachelor's degree and I had just realized this is not what I think I wanted to do with my life. And so I essentially went on a tour of all of the different academic disciplines and possible majors that I could have. Thankfully, in the American system, your first few years are pretty open and you don't start specializing until towards the end. So I still had the flexibility to switch. And it just so happened that the psychology department was still in the communication school. For those of you who don't know, especially in the US, psychology really grew out of the communications idea. So you had sort of a psychoanalytic movement that was separate. You had a behavioral neuroscience movement mainly focused on animals like rats and cats that was separate. And then you had this communications part of psychology. This is in the 1940s and 50s, coming out of World War I. And our university just hadn't updated. So they had left the psychology department in the communications building. And so I happened to stumble into the psychology office. I got a meeting with the chair of the department, and he was a developmental psychologist. And what he had in his office, I always remember, was pictures of himself every 3 years. And so starting with his baby picture all the way till his current image at that time, he was in his 60s. So there were tons of images. And he said, well, what he's interested in as a psychologist is how that baby is the same person as this 60-something-year-old man. And I thought it was fascinating that you could actually study these things. Moreover, it turned out that psychology was all about statistics, as many of you, I'm sure, are beginning to realize. And I was always good at math, and I enjoyed doing math. And so it seemed like a good compromise to sort of end up doing something where I could ask more interesting questions, but I could sort of focus on the math that I'd always been interested in. And so even though I had never done science, I guess I stopped doing any sort of science subject when I was 14, because I was forced to specialize, as I mentioned, and I sort of went in a different direction. I suddenly found myself on a Bachelor of Science program where I'm studying psychology and I'm learning about the brain and cognition and all of the stuff that I now use in my everyday life. when I was about to graduate, like most bachelor students, I had to do a senior thesis. And so for my senior thesis, I wanted to study stereotype threat, which is this phenomena where people who are about to take a test, if they have a group membership that's negatively stereotyped. So for instance, if you're a woman and you're about to take a math test, and you remind this person that they belong to that particular group. So as a woman math test taker, you make me write my name and my gender, then that subtly reminds me about the negative stereotype, and my performance tends to suffer. Well, I just couldn't really buy that phenomena because, again, I had been a nerd and there were negative stereotypes in the US about me based on my racial categorization. And it just didn't make any sense to me that that would make me do less well. If anything, I thought I would actually want to overcome that stereotype and demonstrate to people that I could do better. And so I went and I studied stereotype threat for my senior thesis. I did an experiment. It was wonderful. And so now I'm about to graduate and I'm looking at graduate programs. And my supervisor tells me I should think about social psychology programs. But I kept thinking about education programs. So while I was at Howard, for instance, I had an internship with the Educational Testing Service, which makes the SATs and the GRE. And so I thought I would be a psychometrician and I would be creating tests my whole life, and that would be my path forward. But I listened to my supervisor and I applied to one social psychology program in a pool of education psych programs. And that was a social psych program at Princeton University. And my supervisor there, my future supervisor there was Susan Fisk, who is very famous and studies stereotyping, prejudice, and social cognition. And when I met with Susan in my interview, she said to me, we're trying this thing where we're training social psychology students to do neuroscience as well. Would I be interested? I had no idea about neuroscience. I mean, I'd taken a couple of courses, but I didn't think I wanted to study neuroscience. I went back to my undergraduate supervisor and she said to me, are you kidding me? Like, you have to go do neuroscience. You can't say no to Susan Fisk. And so without knowing what I was getting myself into, I said, sure, Susan, I'd do it. I later found out that she had been asking students this question for about 3 years and nobody was brave enough to say no. So I was the first student who said, sure, I'd give it a shot. And so I started my graduate school at Princeton University. And the very first semester, because they are in the semester system, I was suddenly in classes about magnet physics and brain anatomy, stuff that was very sort of foreign to me, given I had spent most of my time making films and doing these more humanities things. But nonetheless, I was quite happy to be a guinea pig. And after struggling through, I was able to sort of graduate from Princeton with my PhD. But I was able to be jointly trained in both social psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And so I did lots of brain imaging studies in my doctoral training. I actually would moonlight in the labs of other cognitive neuroscientists, people like Jim Haxby and Jonathan Cohen. And they were kind enough to sort of work with me and train me and help me sort of learn how to do the neuroscience stuff. So once I graduated, I thought, well, I like doing social neuroscience. I definitely didn't want to become just a social psychologist, but I didn't feel like my neuroscience was where it should be, right? Because again, my supervisor wasn't a neuroscientist, and I was the one telling her about neuroscience, right? Because her expertise wasn't there. So I ended up getting a postdoc at New York University with Elizabeth Phelps, who is an affective neuroscientist. And so there I was able to really hone my neuroscience skills even further, right? I really got a good grasp of the brain. And I learned a bunch of other physiological techniques. So in my doctoral training, I did fMRI and a little bit of EEG. But now with Liz, I was able to incorporate lots of other types of psychophys like facial EMG and galvanic skin response, for instance. And the other interesting thing that happened while I was in New York is that my interest began to broaden. So Liz would always encourage me, for instance, to go into the domain of legal studies, to go into the domain of economic studies, because there were questions there that were very related to my research. And again, I'm used to listening to my advisors. And so I paid attention and I went to economics meetings and I began to acquire some of these other disciplines that I now use quite extensively in my own research. So my time in New York was really good because it really helped me broaden as an interdisciplinary researcher. And by the time I was ready to leave New York and take my first academic job, I felt like I had a really good set of skills in my toolkit, right? I had sort of done a lot of legal decision-making work and I had done some neuroeconomics work, in addition to the social psychology and the standard cognitive and affective neuroscience. And so after NYU, I took my first academic job at Duke University. And I was appointed both in their Center for Cognitive Neuroscience and in their psychology department, which really sort of spoke to my interdisciplinary nature. Now, Duke was a wonderful place in the sense that the university perhaps was the most interdisciplinary university I had ever experienced. In addition to having their academic departments, they had all of these centers and institutes that fostered interdisciplinarity. So I wasn't somehow unique or different amongst many of my other faculty members. Everyone was sort of coming from this very interdisciplinary perspective as well. And during my time at Duke, I ended up collaborating with evolutionary anthropologists and developmental psychologists. So I continued adding more interdisciplinary skill sets, mainly through collaboration, because by that point, the academic life was becoming too busy to do all of that stuff myself. And so it really provided me a good opportunity to broaden my understanding of other disciplines and to integrate them into my research. I also started at Duke doing some of the sort of policy work and some of the consulting that I'll talk about, where I got to more directly address some of the issues, these sort of big global challenges that were always things I thought were interesting and things that I wanted to address as well. After a relatively short time, I ended up leaving Duke University and moving to Europe. Particularly, specifically, I went to Leiden University in the Netherlands. And the reason I went there is I had sort of developed collaborations with about 3 or 4 of the faculty there. And while I was in sabbatical collaborating with these guys, they had a job opening and they said, would you be interested in staying? And I was having so much fun there, I thought, yes, of course I'd stay. And so I ended up moving to the Netherlands to a social psychology department at Leiden University. And there I continued to do my social neuroscience research, but I also continued to sort of integrate more into these sort of global challenges. So I worked with a number of organizations and institutes that I'll soon talk about, looking at some specific questions around things like human atrocities, for instance. After another short time at Leiden University, I got an email from a faculty member at UCL who wanted me to come across there. Now, UCL was always, I think, the place I wanted to be because UCL had this long history of social cognition research. I mean, the Fritz were here, right? And if you study social cognition, the Fritz is sort of way up on a pedestal. And so the idea of sort of doing social cognition research at UCL was sort of very appealing to me. And so I took the job offer and I came across to UCL. That was about 5 years ago already. And during that time, I've sort of just continued doing what I've been doing. And so I've ended up moving quite a bit in my research trajectory, which is not unusual for academics, particularly academics of color. It's rare that you sort of get an academic job and keep it for your entire career. Most of my friends and colleagues in the field have moved 2 or 3 times as well. But what was nice about my moves, I think, is I kept moving to different countries every time. So it really gave me a breadth of experience that I quite value to this day. So that's my academic trajectory, more or less. And so throughout all of these experiences, what I ended up doing was developing a number of domains of expertise, right? The first one being things like social biases and diversity. Even though I've never really published a paper on prejudice or stereotyping, I think just being a Susan Fiske student meant that people automatically assumed I was an expert in this stuff. And it was in the domain of social cognition, so I knew the literature pretty well, so I could lend some expertise. And I did, and I have ended up doing some empirical research in these topics since. But more interestingly, I am sort of considered an expert for things like artificial intelligence and algorithms, sort of how people perceive these systems. There's all of my legal decision-making expertise, my expertise surrounding things like human atrocities and social justice more broadly. More recently, I've sort of engaged in sort of climate change work as well. And so because of my research topic, which is social cognition, it applies in many different domains. I've been able to apply that expertise in lots of different domains. And so I think of myself as primarily having expertise in what I would call social decision-making, how people think about the world, how do they make decisions about the world, how do they act in the world. Now, of course, that's still very broad, and that allows me to do very interesting sort of applied work when thinking about different companies and different organizations and how I can actually make an impact in some of these big challenges that we face as a species. So what I'm going to do now, I think, is talk to you a little bit about the different ways in which I've been able to apply my research to some of these different areas of expertise and the different organizations that I've been able to work with and the sort of impact I think that my research has had in these different domains. One of the people that I work with, I think annually, is the Legal Defense Fund, which is run out of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in the US. And they're primarily concerned with racial justice. And so what the Legal Defense Fund does, part of what they do, is they focus quite heavily on what we call death eligible cases. These are people in the United States who are on death row. Now, in the US, because of their systemic racism, the majority of these people are African American or Hispanic American. And so they work a lot with public defenders who represent these people, basically trying to save their lives. And so every year I sort of give a lecture to these public defenders and I give them tips and strategies. I go to a number of other legal conferences as well, sort of surrounded this topic. And I talk to them about how legal decision-making works and how the brain works and how people make responsibility decisions and the role the brain plays in that, so that they can develop strategies, for instance, that might be useful in helping their clients stay alive, essentially. Another organization I work closely with is called Over Zero. This is a small organization, nonprofit, that focus primarily on peacekeeping. And so they go into places where, for instance, human atrocities are likely to be committed. So they try to be very proactive with their work. And they've developed sort of indices of human atrocities like genocide. And when they see these bubbling up in a country, they usually go in and try to engage in work that could prevent these things from escalating or sort of getting out of hand. And so I talk to them a lot about, again, human decision-making, how people think about in-groups and out-groups, how do we perceive other people, how do we dehumanize others, all of this stuff that my research is typically focused on. And as an aside, I remember talking to these guys right when Donald Trump got elected in the US, and using their indices, they were terrified that he would become a dictator, right? They saw the fascism coming before the rest of us did. And it really sort of lended validity, I think, to the kind of work that these types of organizations do around the world. So it was striking that they had to sort of do this work in their own backyard as well. I also worked with another nonprofit called Beyond Conflict, which is very similar to Over Zero. And again, they're trying to do the same kind of thing where they're providing tools and mechanisms for people who do peacekeeping work to try to prevent human atrocities. Beyond Conflict has sort of a broader remit than simply human atrocities. They look at things like social justice issues around racism and gender, for instance, as well. So I've done lots of work with them thinking about how can we, for instance, target political leadership to get them interested in these types of issues, and what kinds of interventions could we have that would encourage political leaders to think about preventing human atrocities and social justice violations in their countries. Continuing along this theme, I also work closely with an organization in the US called the Center for Policing Equity. And this is actually an organization that was started by a social psychologist who was a dear friend of mine ever since my days as a graduate student. And what he and his organization does is they go in and they provide training in police departments in the US. Again, trying to prevent police departments and the people who work there from giving into their sort of inherent biases and committing acts of violence against primarily African American people. And so they do lots of interesting sort of outreach with these departments, and I work closely with them. We've sort of written grants together. We've done experiments looking at police decision-making in situations of threat. And so I think a lot of my research applies really nicely to this topic. These days, they're extraordinarily busy, of course, given all that's happened in the US. In addition, I work with another foundation in the US called the Justice Collaboratory. This is something that's run out of Yale Law School, and it was actually part of President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force initiative. So after they ran that task force, the center sort of grew out of it. So this continues the work they've done. And very much like the Center for Policing Equity, they're concerned about sort of policing in America. And what they've done, which is different from CPE, is they tend to focus a lot more on communities. So they try to understand the needs of different communities and how policing can best be tailored to fit those needs. And again, this group is very busy these days as well. Once the sort of George Floyd thing happened and Black Lives Matter happened, people like me and people like these groups became very, very busy. And then in the UK, I do the same kind of work with a group here called Stopwatch, which is again looking at policing, this time in the UK context, with the same kinds of goals as the Center for Policing Equity. So I'm able to apply my research to this real world problem of over-policing, and presumably through the experiments that we do and through the policy papers that we write, we hope to have impacts on this particular topic and this particular issue. Staying on the dark side of human nature, the other thing that we focused on in my research a lot is human atrocities. And I've done a lot of work with different organizations and institutes surrounding human atrocities. We've worked, for instance, with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, so the ICTY. And here, instead of working with the defense side, we're working with prosecutors who are trying to convict people for war crimes and for crimes of genocide and human atrocities. And there, the problem they face is that in the legal code, because of legal intuition, let's say, no scientific research, they target things like dehumanization as causal factors in these atrocities. And so I would go in and talk to them about what dehumanization is and what are the ways dehumanization might manifest itself, besides sort of name calling and labeling groups as this or that. Because the problem they face is when they bring somebody in for trial and they bring in their underlings and they interview them about the mass killings, the underlings never say that the dehumanization caused them to commit the violence, right? They talk about lots of other issues around nationalism and revenge and that type of stuff. And so it's a much more complex picture than simply, as a political leader, I dehumanize in our group, and now people pick up forks and pitchforks and forks and go kill their neighbors, right? It doesn't quite work like that. And so the work we've done with the ICTY, I think it hasn't been successful because those guys have been acquitted because, again, it's difficult to make that causal link stick with dehumanization. But I think it might affect the legal code when it comes to international criminal law and what's considered a necessary causal mechanism for these atrocities. I also work with an organization called the US Institute of Peace, or at least I used to work with this organization before Donald Trump pulled its funding. And what they did essentially was work that's very similar to Above Zero and these other groups, where they're going in and trying to prevent these things from happening, but they also do work on the other side, right? Once these atrocities have happened, they try to sort of work a lot on reconciliation. And again, with this group, I primarily write white papers and opinion papers, giving their experts in the field information about what the latest science says and recommendations from how they can go about and do their jobs better. A lot of my early work focused on perceptions of homeless people, and as a result, I've worked with a couple of different homelessness charities. interestingly, my work with these charities have tended to be much more experimental than sort of policy oriented, because these guys are underground looking for practical solutions. So instead of just quoting the literature to them, I end up actually trying to solve their problems by doing experiments. So for instance, I've done a project with a group called the Museum of Homelessness, where what they do is they collect different objects from homeless people, and then they record stories around those objects, and it gives them an opportunity to tell the homeless person's story without the homeless person being present. And so they will literally take over a space like a museum and display the objects like any other museum exhibition. But along with that, they'll have a performance art piece where they hire actors to sort of tell the stories of the homeless people. And we've done research with them looking at how effective this is as a mechanism for changing people's perspectives about homelessness and homeless people. I also worked with the Durham Rescue Mission in North Carolina when I was at Duke University. And again, here we did experiments with them to see if sort of taking people to soup kitchens and having these kinds of interactions would really change the way people viewed homeless people. And so we've done brain imaging studies with these folks as well. So in addition to these sort of nonprofit organizations, I also do a lot of applied work with policy institutes and think tanks. And here the real benefit is you can't make an immediate impact, but perhaps you can influence policymakers and policy stakeholders. So with these groups, we tend to focus primarily on sort of writing papers that get distributed to different political officials, governments, ministers, etc., trying to sort of make an argument on one side of a policy issue or another. So I do a lot of work with the RSA, which is a very old think tank here in the UK. And we've done work on things like universal basic income, sort of making arguments for universal basic income. We've also done some work on things like economic inequality, so trying to develop measures of economic inequality to provide more evidence about these problems and where they exist. In addition, I also work very closely with the Policy Institute at King's College. And through that Policy Institute, they have a number of what they call policy labs, where they bring in different policy stakeholders to have discussions about a topic. So they would call me in from time to time to be the academic expert. So for instance, I've been involved in the Lamy Law Review, which is an initiative looking at reforming the criminal justice system in the UK, commissioned by David Lamy, who is a Labour MP for Tottenham. We've also looked at things like the Mental Health Act, which is a bit of policy surrounding how you treat people with mental illness in terms of, do you detain them because they're a risk to themselves, and what should be sort of the boundary conditions where you respect their freedoms, but you also try to protect them and other people. So in these policy labs, usually it's a bunch of political scientists, politicians, and then me as the lone scientist. So being able to communicate across discipline is crucial if I want to get my points across about what the science says about these particular issues. For instance, in the case of the Mental Health Act, how do you know, for instance, that somebody has agency? How do you know that somebody has culpability, for instance, for their actions? These are very social cognition questions which politicians are guessing at based on their intuitions, not necessarily the scientific evidence. And then, of course, there are lots of government agencies that I end up working with as well. The first government agency I ever worked with was called the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. This is essentially a group that was created after the Guantanamo Bay scandal in the US. So following 9/11 and the war with Afghanistan, they essentially took a bunch of people from Afghanistan and had them imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, and were torturing them, trying to get information about future terror attacks. The media got wind of it and it created a scandal. This is during the Bush presidency. And so in response to that scandal, they basically took torture away from the FBI and the CIA. And they created this group whose job it was to both sort of commit the torture, although they don't call it torture, they call it interrogation. And also to do research on torture so that they can find better ways of extracting the information. And so working with this group involved going to meetings at the Pentagon with very scary people talking in very scary ways. It was an interesting experience. Beyond them, I've also done work with the Department of the Defense in the US, again, focused on terrorism, looking at ways of sort of preventing sort of the growing of terrorists in different countries around the world and what strategies might be useful in that regard. In the UK, I've worked with Public Health England and things like their stroke campaign, trying to communicate to people things they should do in different emergency situations, like if you think someone might be having a stroke. So there the research is more on sort of decision making, and so my expertise comes in there. And then I also do a little bit with the Government Equalities Office, looking again at sort of social bias and discrimination. And in both of these cases, I'm sitting on panels providing advice. So I'm not really writing anything or conducting experiments. I'm just serving as an academic expert in the room, more or less. But again, in all of these examples, the interdisciplinarity is key, right? Because it allows me to communicate with them. And I can talk as a social neuroscientist, so I can bring to bear the expertise across a few different disciplines on these topics. I also now am a member of the Economic and Social Research Council, and there we're doing lots of work focused on some of these global challenges. So from my seat on the ESRC, I get to direct funding a little bit, so I get to determine, I have a say at least in what should be priorities, what should be the things we're focused on. And that's a different approach to policy, because instead of addressing a particular problem, you get to try to set the agenda for what should be focused on and what's considered sort of pressing. We also do things around graduate training, for instance, or how PhD students should be trained. And because we have this oversight as a funding body, I think we have the ability to have a lot of influence, both in how universities conduct themselves, but also how much money the government dedicates to different types of issues, and when we get our pot of money, how that's best allocated. And then finally, I do work with the university. And I think the work with the university is perhaps the most challenging of everything that I do, because I'm not going talking to strangers, right? I'm talking to my colleagues about lots of issues. So in the Faculty of Brain Sciences, I have a position as the race equity lead. And here we're trying to put in place a number of different measures to improve the experience of Black and minority ethnic students at UCL, to boost the staff experience of Black and minority ethnic staff. And so this involves lots of reform. And it could be anything like, for instance, I've developed a new module for the undergrads focusing on the science of bias to sort of help with bias training. But we also do things like look at hiring practices within the university and hiring policies and figuring out ways of changing it. And again, here what I'm doing is bringing to bear my expertise. So any academic, I think, can fill these roles, but I think I'm able to be more effective because I also have the relevant expertise. So if we're talking about something like bias training, I can leverage my expertise to make recommendations about what the university or the faculty should do regarding this particular issue. And I also sort of do some work with the Anna Freud Center as well, looking at similar types of issues. Anna Freud is part UCL, part not UCL as well. And then finally, the last place that I've started doing work recently, sort of trying to address these challenges, is by going directly to companies. And all of the company work I've done so far has really been focused on sort of diversity and social bias. So we've done experiments with Unilever, for instance, trying to improve the content of their advertisements. Now, Unilever is this big multinational corporation that has a number of different brands all across the world. And all of these brands are making tons of ads, which basically are being seen by millions of people globally. And they're concerned about how they represent different groups within these different societies in these ads. So we would come in and work with their marketeers to try to improve the quality of the ads, to make them more diverse, less biased, etc. We also work with Edelman, which is a public relations company focused on exactly the same thing. In addition to those two, I've worked with a couple of consulting firms that are trying to create diversity training programs for as well. So one is a Swiss firm called The Phil, and another is an AI firm called Pega, and they were particularly interested in bias in AI. So if you're building these algorithms and these artificial intelligences, how can you ensure that you sort of keep them bias free when perhaps a lot of the data they're being trained on has bias in it as well. So if you take, for instance, the recent A-level scandal, where this algorithm was essentially downgrading students at public compared to private universities, based on the historical performance of these schools, that's a case where the systemic bias has infiltrated the algorithm. And so we do that work as well. And then I sit in a number of academic boards for other companies as well, sort of fulfilling the same purpose, talking to them about diversity, etc. The last thing I do in an attempt to address these global challenges is I try to communicate the science. I talked about specific communication to different organizations and institutes, but communicating to the public is just as important as well. And so I spend a lot of time talking to journalists. So I've done tons of podcasts and radio interviews for a number of different companies in the US and the UK talking about these different issues. I also have been in a couple of different documentaries where people are making a documentary about the brain, for instance, and I'll come in and talk about the dark side of human nature. And now I'm talking to general audiences when I'm doing this. So again, I have to be able to communicate the science in a way that's easily digestible by anyone who hears it. And then finally, tons of reporters for magazines and newspapers, websites, blogs, where again, I do these interviews, people who are writing books, for instance. For example, today I just received in the mail a book from an author who wrote a book on homelessness in the UK. And he did lots of interviews with me trying to understand the science behind how people perceive homeless people. And so a book like that can have great impact, right? Because it's going out into the general public. If people read it and they're convinced by the arguments, they put into practice the things we've been talking about, presumably we can address these issues. And then I think what I do the most is what I'm doing now, right? Tons of lectures, both in the academic context where you go talk to different universities, but also public lectures, lectures at science festivals, lectures in pubs, lectures in lots of places where I'm not just talking to other academics or students, but I'm talking to the general public about these issues, informing them about these issues, making them aware of the latest science. And again, presumably that has an impact. And then finally, as I mentioned before, I'm involved in writing lots of policy papers. These are called white papers, which go directly to political decision makers and hopefully influence them. And so what I've learned across my career is that it is possible to sort of harness my interdisciplinary approach to adjust these global practices. And I would encourage all of you to do that as well if you're interested in trying to solve some of these big challenges we face as a society. Again, I think there's a place for people who are niche within their discipline, but I think taking the interdisciplinary approach allows you to do a lot more than simply sort of focusing on what your discipline says. So one of the things I've learned is to sort of focus on my own trajectory. Because academia is very siloed, it's very difficult to do interdisciplinary work because it's very hard for your colleagues to evaluate that work if they're coming from a different discipline. And so I've learned to sort of not listen to what other people say in a sense, and to trust that what I'm doing is essentially valuable. And so that means I've focused on myself, because if I look out in the field, I don't see many researchers operating the way that I do. And so I don't have necessarily a path or a guide. And so I have to make these decisions myself, and I have to trust my instincts on this. And I have to just trust the science as well. I have to go where the science takes me. The other thing that I would recommend, the other lesson I've learned, is communication skills are paramount. You can be the greatest scientist in the world. If you can't communicate your science to different audiences, it's essentially useless. And so there's often the example of the famous academic who you can't wait to hear give a talk. And then you go to the talk and you're completely disappointed. You have no idea what they were talking about. Their communication skills aren't up to the point where they're able to really get their message across. So being able to communicate to people who aren't steeped in your discipline is really key, whether that person is a guy off the street or it's another academic at a university, but in a different discipline, so they don't understand the theory and the jargon. So communication is key, and being interdisciplinary really helps that, because you're forced constantly to talk to people who aren't in your discipline, right? So yesterday alone, for instance, I spoke to philosophers, and then I spoke to developmental psychologists, and then I spoke to social psychologists. Those three groups of people use very different languages, and so being able to communicate the same message to all of them is important. The other thing you have to think about are the different applications of your work. So when I committed to doing psychology, one of the things that really convinced me was that it gave me the ability, I thought, to address a very important issue that nobody was studying at the time, which was dehumanization. So I thought, if I could learn more about dehumanization, how people do these horrible things to other people, then that would help. But there are all of these other applications for my work that I didn't really have in mind. And I think once I was open to these other applications around artificial intelligence, for instance, it really allowed me to make a broader contribution than simply focusing on what I thought my research should be applied to. And then lastly, collaboration. I couldn't do any of this interdisciplinary work if I didn't collaborate. And so I rely heavily on my collaborators because I can't be an expert in all of these disciplines. That's impossible. So I know enough that I can get by, and I can speak the language. So I take the time to learn the jargon and a few key theories, but I depend on my collaborators to really help me get this done. So every time I do interdisciplinary work, there's a collaborator in that discipline on those papers to really ensure that I'm not just making it up, right? I think lots of people, when they do interdisciplinary work, they think they understand what the other discipline means, but it really pays, I think, to have that expert there who can sort of guide you along. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention and open up to any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much.